This is understandable politics. Hello, the Western wing of the world, when the situation in a country doesn't go according to their plan, starts talking about human rights. And the main guardian becomes the organization Human Rights Watch. On paper, and in the right media, they are knights of truth and international law. But what really lies behind these supposedly good intentions? We provide the facts, you draw the conclusions. Let's start with the basics. Human Rights Watch is on paper a non-governmental and of course non-profit organization. It is positioned as a private, independent entity headquartered in New York.
The organization was founded in 1978 and monitors human rights in 70 countries worldwide. Belarus is also on this list. The watch was founded by activists Robert Bernstein, Jerry Leiber, and Arya Neer. The main goal of the organization is declared to be the protection of human rights worldwide.
The organization's website has many beautiful words. The main goals are finely detailed, protecting everyone from everything, just angels of political and public life.
We help victims and activists prevent discrimination, defend political freedom, protect people from the cruelty of war, and hold violators accountable. We investigate and publicize human rights violations and call for accountability. We demand that governments and authorities stop violations and respect international human rights norms. We mobilize the public and the international community to support the fight for human rights for all.
We won't argue, it sounds noble. However, even the origin of the organization is deeply rooted in politics and the fight against the Soviet Union.
In 1976, Robert Bernstein visited Moscow and met with academician Sakharov and several other well-known Russian human rights activists. Long conversations with them led Bernstein to the idea of creating an organization in the USA that would systematically support human rights activists in the Soviet Union. Indeed, 2 years after groups were formed in Moscow and other cities of the USSR in the spring of 1976, to monitor the Soviet authorities' compliance with the Helsinki Accords on Human Rights, the third basket, Robert Bernstein created a human rights organization in New York called the U.S. Helsinki Watch Committee. Its mission was declared to be the protection of human rights groups in the USSR and Eastern Europe, and to support their activities in publicizing human rights violations in these countries.
In reality, it's just an organization that, under the guise of human rights, is one of those that create the possibility of staging a revolution, a color revolution, creating chaos and anarchy in a country that, in their opinion, is unfriendly to them. And the regimes in those countries must be immediately overthrown. That's all. So don't rely too much on the idea that Human Rights Watch is truly a human rights organization. It's just a beautiful fairy tale, nothing more. There's no talk of human rights there. It's just a cover they use to receive huge sums of money while they train personnel who later return to their countries and stage coups.
Note, in the USSR and Eastern Europe,
under this guise, something more interesting was initially hidden. During the Cold War, the USA needed a tool for political pressure and subversive work against the USSR.
A little later, the Helsinki Committee was renamed Human Rights Watch.
The Helsinki Accords required all states to uphold human rights according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thus, after the Soviet leadership signed the agreements, Western partners had a fully legal tool for influence on the international stage. Now, interference in the internal affairs of the USSR became a fully legal activity. The Soviet leadership lost the ability to expose this activity as subversive, serving the interests of the USA and other Western states. After all, now human rights activists relied on a doctrine of universally recognized human rights.
An annual budget of over $70 million, but where the organization got and gets the money is a separate topic. Official documents of the watch state, we exist on private investors' funds, not accepting any government assistance. There are many hidden pitfalls here too. To work in favor of certain countries, it's not necessary to receive direct transfers from the client state. Who said that the private funds and philanthropists Human Rights Watch relies on don't serve American interests? We'll prove this with just the main sponsors. Usually, donors remain in the shadows, but in 2010, one of them revealed his cards. The founder of the Open Society Foundations, George Soros, donated $100 million in the largest grant from his structures to expand global presence. The same Soros notorious for his subversive actions against many countries.
Human Rights Watch is one of the most effective organizations I support, said Soros. The funds HRW will receive from Soros will be used to hire new staff and expand its international network. Today, HRW, based in New York, is represented in almost 70 countries worldwide, with a staff of nearly 300 people.
Of course, the benevolent father of color revolutions wasn't investing in charity, but investing. After Soros's donation, the watch's staff increased by 120 people. Special attention again to Eastern Europe and the Middle East.
What is known about such a generous donor, Soros? Since 1989, he has openly engaged in political activities, assisting in the overthrow of undesirable regimes. Soros admits that the foundation he created in Ukraine took an active part in the 2014 coup. Soros's associate Weinstein, head of the National Endowment for Democracy, said, "Today we openly do what the CIA did covertly 25 years ago."
Is it any wonder that Soros gave money and 4 years later the Ukrainian Maidan and a violent coup occurred in Ukraine? So much was done there, but the organization suddenly lost its vision.
Seemingly innocent concepts of human rights, peace, and democracy take on an ideological load in Soros's hands. Democracy implies supporting color revolutions in Eurasian countries and imposing discussions of homosexuality in traditionally conservative societies.
Again, an independent human rights organization accepts $100 million from a man who openly does not hide his geopolitical ambitions and who, 10 years ago, wanted to provoke the European Union to wake up urgently and start behaving like countries in a state of covert war.
All available resources should be directed to military efforts, even if it leads to a budget deficit.
Later, the organization's check on Ukraine predictably failed. Unlike the OSCE, Human Rights Watch was not caught spying for the Ukrainian armed forces, but their reports are a separate kind of fake art.
A famous example is a photo of a woman suffering from repression in Moscow. Human Rights Watch published this photo with such a caption on their social media. Later, it turned out the woman was indeed in shock. But from the arson of the trade union house in Odessa on May 2, 2014.
Another example is Crimea. Since 2014, the Watch has annually released reports claiming that Russians persecute Crimean Tatars. At the same time, the organization itself does not hide that Human Rights Watch has not been to the peninsula. They collected facts remotely.
Human Rights Watch representatives indeed have not been to Crimea, have not seen the situation, have not talked to people, and have not monitored the situation on the ground. And this is not accidental, it's not some oversight of the organization. The fact is that Human Rights Watch is not what they claim to be. This organization has nothing to do with human rights activities. It is, so to speak, an element, an institution of struggle against our country.
This is another of the organization's largest donors. Again, American capital and American ambitions.
In 1966, the president of the Ford Foundation became McGeorge Bundy, an ultra-hawk according to contemporaries and historians. Bundy came from the position of director of the U.S. National Security Council and chairman of the so-called 303 Committee, which coordinated U.S. covert operations worldwide.
The foundation worked as a proven tool for subversion in various countries. In the late 80s, it launched projects to assist civil institutions in the USSR, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. For what purpose? Of course, to promote democratic and economic reforms in these countries. Since the early 1950s, the foundation has allocated nearly $100 million to support freedom of speech, cultural pluralism, and human rights in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe.
American and European democracy has created a huge number of non-governmental organizations to monitor foreign states that they consider a threat and allegedly violate human rights. These organizations are funded by global figures like Soros, the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, who dream of world domination and subjugating all countries to themselves. Doctors Without Borders, White Helmets, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and many others are all fake news spreaders, blowing soap bubbles to the tune of Soros's dollars.
The next donor is a private family foundation, again based overseas. It is among the top 10 largest private foundations in the USA, with assets over $6 billion.
The stated goals include supporting bright, creative individuals and groups of people who contribute to creating a more just, environmentally clean and safe world. In practice, everything is much more complicated. Behind the curtain of verbal sketches lie much more cynical interests.
Who led the support for bright, creative groups? International projects at the MacArthur Foundation from 2007 to 2014 were led by Barry Lowenkron. Previously, he worked at the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, the National Intelligence Council, and even the CIA. Since 1991, this foundation has actively funded organizations engaged in political activities in Russia, and in 2015, it was recognized as an undesirable organization.
So human rights defenders are closely linked with power and capital. And it turns out that since the Cold War, Americans have had a tool that allows them to infiltrate another country under the false flag of a non-governmental organization. But arrogance and vanity prevail. Sometimes they admit it themselves.
HRW itself openly admits that it contributed to the revolutions in Eastern Europe and the USSR in the late 80s, attacking undesirable governments through the media and direct connections with politicians. As a result, the fight for human rights led to dramatic democratic transformations in the late 80s. Thus, a non-governmental organization participated in implementing the official U.S. foreign policy doctrine, which aimed at destroying the USSR as an evil empire. As Oleg Popov, who participated in the human rights movement for 20 years, stated, HRW took on the functions of information and propaganda support for diplomatic, economic, and military intervention by NATO countries, primarily the USA, in the internal affairs of other countries.
The statement by Human Rights Watch head Ken Roth in 2013 comes to mind, where he called for bombing Syria to protect civilians. No further comments needed. I suggest we focus more on our country. The relationship between Minsk and Human Rights Watch is exactly the same as between Belarus and the USA.
Over the years, the Watch has accused us of unprecedented repression and infringement of freedom of speech, and this rhetoric of the impartial organization persisted long before the events of 2020.
For example, in 2016, Belarus was criticized for the Ministry of Information's ability to block access to information sites. At that time, the USA had a foreign agent law through which Washington sent media to the bank for over 70 years.
The organization constantly criticizes the Belarusian electoral system and major political campaigns in our country, no matter how they are conducted. It constantly voices worn-out cliches about the alleged cleansing of civil society, torture, and persecution of opponents without providing any evidence. And it also surprisingly repeats almost verbatim the old song of opposition and extremist figures, calling people who broke the law political prisoners.
Another interesting case Criticism from Human Rights Watch for these words of the president.
I call this coronavirus nothing but a psychosis, and I will never renounce this because, together with you, I have experienced many psychoses, and we know what it led to. I am absolutely convinced that this is yet another hysteria that will benefit some and harm others. But we live in a specific situation, and naturally we must proceed from the circumstances that are developing not only in our country but also beyond its borders. Why do I behave this way? Because I am absolutely convinced that we can suffer more from panic than from the virus itself.
Throughout the pandemic, President Lukashenko ignored the seriousness of COVID-19. The authorities did not implement any containment measures despite the high transmission rate among the population. The authorities in Minsk and several other cities required masks in public places. The authorities tried to silence medical workers who spoke about the dangers of the pandemic.
Of course, such statements were made by human rights activists out of habit, probably reading extremist news feeds. In hindsight, many recognize that Belarus is one of the few countries that handled the coronavirus pandemic with dignity.
Today, Belarus is perceived as virtually the only country of classical old Europe that people of the 40-50-year-old generation still remember, in the sense that yes, it is indeed that very European country with its own views on life, its own interests, the ability to defend its rights, its sovereignty, and to uphold its national interests. This is all thanks to the Belarusian people, leader Alexander Lukashenko, who independently tries to fight with them in one way or another and defend Belarus's position to the whole world.
Such is the watch, or guardians of our rights. Extremely selective. They can't find a speck in the eyes of Belarus, Russia, and China, but seeing, say, the crimes of Ukraine or Israel, not to mention the Pentagon, is not so clear. What to say about the main donor, the USA? There, according to Human Rights Watch, as in Western Europe, nothing but a donor. A paradise garden.
HRW's claims that it exists solely on private donations hide the real picture. In the USA, human rights activists, big capital, and power are inextricably linked by lobbying ties, as acknowledged by Western researchers. In their opinion, HRW's close ties with the US authorities disqualify its claims of independence.
What kind of independence can there be with such a connection to American power? Human Rights Watch might as well be called a subsidiary fund of the local elite. And if you change the first letter in the word watch, you might get a succinct description of their entire work.
By a strange coincidence, human rights issues are handled exclusively by career officers of the U.S. intelligence services. This applies to the organization's sponsors as well.
The conclusion is quite obvious. These and other human rights activists are nothing more than a convenient tool of influence capable of brainwashing and slandering on command when needed by the client. The alliance of big capital and hawks has pursued only one American goal for many years: to undermine and overthrow unwanted politicians and subjugate stubborn countries. Remember this when you see the next reports, including those about Belarus. Goodbye.